Hi, everybody. I'm here today with Dr. Alex Byrne, who is a professor of philosophy at MIT. He is the author of numerous books, and he co-edited the Norton Introduction to Philosophy. His main interests are philosophy of mind, metaphysics, and epistemology. He has been a professor of philosophy for 3 decades, and in the past several years, his work has focused on philosophical issues relating to sex and gender. So his most recent book is called Trouble with Gender, Sex Facts, Gender Fictions. It's out now. I have it here on my Kindle, and I'd like to discuss it with you today, Dr. Byrne. And first, I'll just say thank you for joining me. It's a real pleasure to get to speak with you. And I'd like to start just by asking you about the journey to get this book published. So you've written about this really scandalous story where Oxford University Press, one of, if not the most prestigious publishers in the world, accepted your book proposal and then later decided not to publish it. Can you tell us a bit about what happened there?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me on, Sasha. I remember reading about your cancellation. What is it now? Four years ago or something.
Yep, 2020.
Anyway, so it's great to be on your podcast. Yeah. So I guess I started thinking about sex and gender because it was a very hot topic within philosophy, as well as in the wider culture around 2018, and this was about the time that a British philosopher called Kathleen Stock, well, I'm sure you know, was writing about sex and gender, and in particular raising some questions about proposed reforms that the then centre-right government of the UK was proposing to the 2004 Gender Recognition Act, which would have resulted in a form of gender self-ID. And Kathleen was getting a huge amount of pushback for that, which I was somewhat scandalized by myself, and I started digging into the literature, and I wrote various things, some pieces for general audiences. One was about whether sex is binary. And then I wrote, this was probably the high point or perhaps the low point of my career. I wrote a philosophy paper called Are Women Adult Human Females? Which, after getting rejected from many journals, eventually got published in a good journal called Philosophical Studies. And there was a huge fuss about that, and that's a long story. The editor-in-chief of that journal actually ended up resigning over it. Anyway, by that point, I'd accumulated a fair bit of material about sex and gender. I thought, oh yeah, I have something to contribute to this topic. So, partly I thought I had something to contribute because I've read so many online discussions of sex and gender and what sex is or what a woman is and so on. What exactly is the distinction between sex and gender? And I basically disagreed with all of it. And I also disagreed with what most of my professional colleagues were saying in philosophy who are writing on these topics. Anyway, so I thought I had something to contribute, and I had the idea for a trade book that is not a scholarly monograph, as we say, but a book for a general audience, like Kathleen's Material Girls or Helen Joyce's Trans, although unlike Helen's book or Kathleen's book, I wasn't going to wade into sort of hot, super third rail, 20,000 volt social/political issues about gender affirming care or whether trans women should be allowed to compete in the female sporting category or anything like that. So I was sticking my neck out less than Kathleen and Helen had done. Anyway, So I shopped the book around, and eventually Oxford University Press, I published a book with them before on how you know your own mind, basically. And as you say, they're a very prestigious publisher. In fact, they're the number one publisher for glossy books in the entire world. And they promised to publicize the book to a general audience, and they were very enthusiastic at the start. And again, cutting a very long story short, when I submitted the manuscript. So normally, as you know, right, you worked in publishing. So at any rate, in the world of academia, what happens is you submit the first draft of the manuscript, and then it gets sent out to external referees, and they write reports, and then you revise the manuscript. I mean, sometimes you revise it a lot, sometimes you revise it a little. At any rate, you're supposed to take the commentary into account. That typically makes for a better book. And I was expecting the very same procedure to be followed in the case of my book. And I did, in fact, get referee reports, but it turned out that they had really nothing to do with OUP's decision, which was that they were not going to publish my book because, what was the phrase? I didn't treat the subject in a sufficiently serious or respectful way, giving no examples of the sort of lack of respect I had shown in the book, or why I wasn't. I mean, there are some jokes in the book, but come on. By and large, it's pretty serious. And anyway, so that was it. I mean, I could have fought back, but at that time, the climate was so bad, and my friend Holly Lawford Smith had run into huge problems with her book with OUP, Oxford University Press, called Gender Critical Feminism. Eventually it was published, but OUP made Holly jump through some entirely necessary hoops, and in advance of publication, 2 open letters, one signed by people in Oxford University Press's New York office, appeared, admonishing Oxford University Press for publishing such a terrible book, which, of course, since it hadn't been published, none of the letter writers had actually read, and trying to make OUP promise never to do such a terrible thing again. So anyway, then, like, fast forward to the present, eventually Polity Press, which is a small but well-regarded press in the UK, agreed to publish it. Even then, that was hardly plain sailing. And anyway, so it's published. It came out earlier this year in the US, and I don't know. You have to tell me what you think, but it's like, if you read the thing, it's just so hard to see what all the fuss could possibly have been about. It's like baffling. Anyway, but you're the insider in the publishing industry, so I'm keen to hear your reaction or commentary on the whole affair. I have to say, sorry, just one other thing.
Please.
I mean, as you know yourself, it's, being cancelled. I mean, I wasn't cancelled really, but my book was literally cancelled. And typically those things, unless you're unfortunate enough to lose your job, which happened to you, but typically those things like benefit the cancelled person. So they always backfire. I mean, this is the activists just do not seem to learn this lesson. I just don't understand it. So of course I got all this free publicity, which I never would have done if the book had been published by Oxford University Press. And for example, here I am on your podcast. You probably wouldn't have invited me had I just written this book for OUP, which had subsequently sunk without trace, as it almost certainly would have done. So in the end, I suppose I'm grateful to OUP that they actually cancelled it. Although, of course, it was like touch and go whether the book would actually be be published at all for a while, so it was all pretty stressful. Um, and oh, sorry, and then just one other thing I should just emphasize. This kind of thing where you're, especially when you're an established academic and you've published with the press before and so on, and you've got this undeniable track record. This kind of thing where your manuscript that you have a contract for, which comprises 100,000 words, is just rejected without allowing you to reply to any sort of criticism or to make revisions. I mean, that's basically unheard of in like any other area of philosophy. It's just, of course, as you know, there's something very special about sex and gender.
Yeah, most definitely. So, I mean, it really bothered me that OUP approved your proposal. They were fine with it. They were happy with it. And then it seems like in so many of these cases, something happened later where it
Yeah.
wasn't about the content, right? Because as you said, they accused you of not treating it in a serious manner. That's just ridiculous when you look at the book and look at also the context of what you're replying to. If you want to talk about stuff being written not in a serious or respectful manner, you have to look at what the trans activists have written and been saying for years now.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry, just to add a footnote to that. So
Please.
there's an Oxford University Press philosophy book. Actually, I mentioned this in one of the numerous notes in my Trouble with Gender, which in the topic of feminist philosophy, which uses the word TERF to describe TERFs or gender critical feminists. And this is in like a serious work of academic philosophy. And of course, you would in the normal run of things, one academic would never describe her opponents using some disparaging, pejorative term. But that's like totally fine. And there are other examples of this sort of thing as well.
Yeah,
So,
and it's
OUP was perfectly fine with that.
right. Right.
I didn't call, well, if you've read the thing, you'll see, I'm quite respectful in the book. I mean, of course, I criticize people's arguments, but that's a different matter entirely. But I don't use like disparaging terms to talk about the opposition.
Right. Yeah, of course. And the term turf being, something that came from probably Tumblr originally, that it's definitely not appropriate, like you're saying, in the academic world in a serious text, unless it's being discussed, not just
Yeah,
being,
sure, yeah,
lobbed at
yeah,
people.
right, exactly, yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm. And then, I'm also thinking of another author whose book got canceled by his publisher, who's Jordan Peterson. And a story that came out of that cancellation was his second 12 Rules for Life book, so 12 more Rules for Life. And
Oh, right. Is that the Order and Chaos one, or is that
I
the
think
like a
I
third
have it
one?
here. Oh, it's Beyond Order.
Oh,
Beyond
Beyond.
Order,
Okay, yeah,
12
right,
more
right.
Rules
Okay,
for Life.
I see. Right,
Mm-hmm.
right.
So when
Oh,
that
I didn't.
book,
Oh, that's right. That's right. I remember. I remember something about this.
there was, you may remember this, a story came out from the publishers that some of the younger staffers and interns were crying at a meeting about the
Oh
book.
no, I do remember that. Yeah.
They were crying at the prospect of working on this book. They were so emotionally affected by it, or maybe they were, putting that on, performing it. And I wonder if you ever heard any stories or got any insight as to what was going on within
Yeah.
OUP.
It would be so great if people were crying over my book. Yes, I
Right.
should really have one of these, like, woke tears mugs or something.
There you go.
In
Yeah.
fact, I don't.
Mm-hmm.
No. What one? Okay, so let me add something else about OUP. So I already mentioned Holly Lawford Smith. So she had this gender critical feminism book, which was published in 2022. And she was also working on a second book for OUP, a book called Sex Matters. Same title as Helen Joyce's organization. And this was just a collection of sort of gender critical essays. And she had a contract for that. And just after my book was cancelled, her book was cancelled too, on different grounds. This time, the grounds were not that it was disrespectful or anything like that, although, like, in terms of, saying things that people might find offensive or something, I would have thought Holly's way out there more than I am. Anyway, those weren't the grounds for rejecting Sex Matters. Rather, the grounds were that the book was too similar to gender critical feminism, which is absolutely preposterous. It's just like an absurd excuse. And what happened was Holly, unlike me, fought back and contacted the UK. We have this organization called the Free Speech Union in the UK. And what seems to have happened is that the Free Speech Union threatened OUP with a lawsuit, and then they backed down and published Sex Matters. And as a result of that and my cancellation, these events were discussed a lot on the philosophy blogs. And someone who was, I think, at the time at the University of Oxford, or maybe not, anyway, put in a freedom of information request to OUP to get like emails or documents or whatever. But I strongly suspect that it went nowhere. So the answer to your question is, unfortunately, we don't know. We don't know what happened.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, something. I mean, of course, it might not have been. I'm sure it wasn't anything particularly sinister. It's at least one thing that I've learnt through these experiences is that publishers tend to be extremely cautious people, and just like obviously very worried by that they might publish something that will bring opprobrium on their heads or get them tarred as purveyors of bigoted views or something like that. And I would have, like naively thought that you would go into publishing because you think, oh gosh, it's really great to get a diverse range of views out there and to read books which challenge your worldview or say vaguely heterodox things. I mean, that's part of the joy of reading.
Yeah, and
but obviously that's not true.
You would think so, right? That's what I thought too when I entered the publishing industry.
Right.
And people told me like, well, you're gonna be disillusioned because you're all talking about, the literature that you read in college, and that's not what this is about. This is about commercial books. Of course, I was in commercial publishing, not academic.
Right.
But
right.
But
even yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry to interrupt, but
no,
that's
really, okay.
This is really just a question for you because I'm often puzzled by this. So the fact is that controversial books often sell very well.
Mm-hmm.
So Helen's book, which I think was picked up by exactly one publisher, sold extremely well. Kathleen's book, which again was picked up by only one publisher, has sold extremely well. Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage, which not only was it only picked up by one publisher, that publisher is Regenery, I think, if that's how you pronounce the name. It's an openly right-wing publisher, so they already have this ideological agenda, and they do publish some pretty crazy shit, basically. So, that's not the best the best look sort of publisher's imprint to have. But anyway, that of course has sold exceptionally well.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Exceptionally well, in fact, been a sort of runaway
yeah,
runaway bestseller.
yes.
So, just from a purely commercial point of view,
Hmm.
why don't the higher ups in these publishers say to their to their woke underlings, look, you'll have to suck it up because we've got a huge moneymaker on our hands.
Well, I mean, I think there are two things. One is kind of the stupidity of it all, and you mentioned
Mm,
like the backwardness of canceling something because it gets so much more attention and it sells
mm,
so many more copies. So there's that. I mean, there's sort of the stupidity behind cancellation where when you shine a bright light on someone who's really saying very
right,
reasonable things, that
right.
more people are going to look, and that's always been the case with censorship and
Yeah,
cancellation. But then there's also the cowardice too, because I think the aspect that you just mentioned where why don't the higher ups just say like it doesn't matter, your sensitivities or anyone's sensitivities really, because we're going to have a discussion about this when it gets published. A literary discussion will be had, and it will be talked about. That's what we want. You would think that's what they would say, but they're scared. They're too scared to do that, and so they do block their own success in a way. And I will tell an anecdote from when I was working in the publishing industry. I only had 1 month before I got canceled of actually being a professional. Like I was an intern prior to that for
mm,
a while, and then I was hired, and it was only 1 month before I was canceled. But during that month, I was on a small team of other literary agents, and one of them, he was a white guy. And I only mention that because he made that important in this story. So he told us that he had been invited on a panel about, I don't remember exactly, but I think it was about diversity in publishing. And he said he declined his spot so that it could go to someone else who wasn't a white cis male. And I mean, not only is that ridiculous, and why would you take your own voice off of it, but I think that's just completely performative and
yeah.
just. I mean, he was probably just busy that day, and then he wanted to just sound like a really good person for not doing it. That was my theory. But yeah, I mean, and then there's also the lack of the conversation that they're even willing to have. So like you said, there was no discussion about why they're rejecting your book, or there was no room for you to answer any of
Right.
their concerns. And I,
Yeah.
I experienced the same thing as well when I got fired. I asked, can we talk about this? But no, it was done. And that was the part that really surprised me, was that naively, I think, looking back, was that there was not even room for any discussion at all.
No,
So, I mean, tell me
that's right.
what you think of this, but when people describe it as kind of like a mind virus, I think, as sensational as that sounds, it does seem kind of accurate to me, because what is it that's infecting these otherwise intelligent people's minds that's making them, make these decisions that, like you said, are kind of against their own commercial interests in a way.
Right. Um, I mean it. Right. I mean, I think the picture is somewhat clearer in uh, in philosophy because then we don't have the distraction of the commercial interests. So uh, I think it. So the situation in philosophy was bad and still continues to be bad. It's very hard for, let's call my side, it's not really a side, but let's call them the gender critical philosophers. That just means philosophers who work on sex and gender and who dispute some of the sort of orthodox claims made in mainstream, usually mainstream feminist philosophy, which is the sort of branch of the subject that at least historically has dealt with questions about sex and gender. And I think what happens is you get this very vocal minority who are very keen to impose their point of view and banish the heretics from the profession, and they are able to essentially threaten other philosophers with excommunication or shame or ostracism if they step out of line. And most people, like, understandably, don't want to. They don't want to risk their careers. They don't want to make their work environments unpleasant. They don't want to get tarred as bigots um, on 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 social media, and so just out of simple, just ordinary, perfectly understandable the human need for self-preservation, people just keep their heads down and don't speak up. So that's one. Maybe that's the sort of vast majority of professional philosophers, and then there are these junior philosophers, grad students, and junior faculty who work in sex and gender. And if the counselors are respected senior figures who are the mentors essentially of these junior people, then again it's only natural that they just fall in line and assume that, yeah, well, what these authority figures are saying is right and justifiable, and these other people like Kathleen or Holly or me are just bad people who should not be writing about these topics and who are just doing great harm to some marginalized group. Um, so it's, yeah, I don't know if that's an entirely satisfactory answer to your question, but it's I guess I think this is just an instance of sort of common human dynamics that doesn't require any sort of special theory to explain. You don't need to say, "Oh gosh, suddenly there's this mysterious mind virus that has infected a whole bunch of people, and we haven't seen anything like this before." I think this kind of thing happens quite frequently, and as soon as you get that sort of dynamic going, where there are people in positions of power who are very active and vocal and cancellation and censorship minded, then they tend to bring along a lot of their followers, and the vast majority of people sensibly duck down behind the parapet. It's just not really worth their time to get involved and take the risk of speaking out.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not worth their time. They can easily say that's not my issue. But
Yeah, right.
mhm,
No, that's another thing. I mean, it's very
mhm,
easy to, especially since all this is, within philosophy, this is carried on within a small sub-discipline of the subject, and it's a big and sprawling subject, and people specialize and know a lot about this and a lot less about this. It's very, very easy for people to rationalize their decision not to say anything by saying, "Well, I mean, I don't work in this area. I don't really know what the issues are, and I'll just leave it up to the experts." And
mhm.
if the experts are saying that Kathleen Stock and Holly are terrible philosophers and bad human beings, well, whatever. I'll just defer to the experts. At any rate, I won't get involved.
Yeah, and well, and not only defer to the experts because I mean, it could easily be said that you and those other writers are experts on these topics as well, but defer to, like you said earlier, the young generation that's saying this is on the wrong side of history. So there's also that
Yeah, no,
other
that's right.
side of it where it's not just,
That is
like
right.
you said earlier, like
That's
it's
right.
not just top down, it's also coming from the bottom. And it's almost like the Hitler Youth effect, where it's like the young generation saying, you're going to go down on the wrong side of history if you dare to ask a single question about these new ideas.
Yeah. Sasha, we're barely 30 minutes into the
And
podcast
I've already
and
said
already you
Hitler.
have mentioned Hitler.
Darn it. Set a new record. Actually,
But
probably
yeah, no,
not.
that is right. That's right. That's another dynamic as well, right? Yeah, which I didn't mention, namely that if if there's a bunch of young people or graduate students who are really passionate about some issue and uh, wield their activism to try and cancel established academics, then at least these days, they could very well have a lot of power, and it can be hard for the for more established people who are ostensibly higher up in the status hierarchy uh, to resist. I should, yeah, just on and just on the younger generation, I should emphasize that, of course, sometimes cancellation can be really uh, harmful to the person who's cancelled. So in your case, you actually lost your job. So it can have a direct harmful effect like that, but it has a much more pernicious effect on people who are, let's say, coming into publishing or coming into philosophy. So you already know coming into publishing that, let's say, gender critical views are going to be unwelcome. You already know coming into philosophy that gender critical views are going to be unwelcome. And so this tends to either filter out younger people who otherwise would have gone into publishing or philosophy, or at least in philosophy, it makes them keep their heads down and work on other things. I mean, after all, there are an enormous number of things to think about in philosophy. You don't have to think about sex and gender. Even if you're interested in it, you can easily find something else to be interested in. And so the net result is that the proportion of specialists in sex and gender who are censoriously inclined tends to increase, and the intellectual monoculture tends to spread, and the diversity of thought diminishes. So yeah, I think that's the point that can't really be emphasized enough. It's, often your sympathies go out to the individual who is actually cancelled, but deservedly so. I mean, they deserve our sympathies, but often the the really bad effects are much further downstream.
Yeah, and I wonder also if it's a similar effect happening in publishing with just the quality and the, like you referenced earlier, you would think going into publishing, people would be interested in critical thinking books that are sparking provocative debates and asking difficult
Yeah,
questions and grappling with the difficult issues, even the dark sides of humanity and of life. And then you don't see that at all. So I think maybe there's a similar effect there in the book world, because everything has gotten so, well, dumbed down, but just generally like milk toast and just bland in the way that when they choose
yeah,
the books, it's like, okay, don't choose anything that could ruffle feathers in this area. Choose something that
right,
is going to appeal to the woke crowd, or the just sort of like the
yeah,
lowest common denominator even.
yeah, yeah,
It seems like that's at play in other areas too, as well, like you're saying
right,
with philosophy or with academics. But I'm
yeah.
also curious to ask you, within your academic world, within, your department, the philosophy department, what is it like for you there? Do you have these discussions with your colleagues, with your students? Like, what's the kind of the atmosphere like?
Yeah, no, it's basically been fine. I think maybe some people don't approve of what I've been doing, but generally we've been over the years we've been an extremely collegial department. But yeah, I'm sure there's like a diversity of views on the topic. But yeah, basically it's been okay, thank goodness. I mean, I can imagine. Well, certainly for Kathleen, it was really terrible. I mean, professionally, she seems to have had very little support from her professional colleagues. But then, her cancellation was much harder. I've not had people protesting outside my office or putting up stickers in the bathroom demanding that I be fired or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's more, in professional contexts outside the department, like the book cancellation, and there were like various other cancellations, and there have been some like truly insane moments that I never thought I would sort of live to see. I was expecting just to carry on being some relatively harmless academic leading a pretty boring life until all this happened.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the most insane moments?
Well, one was where um, Holly Holly and Thomas Bogardus, who's another philosopher who teaches at Pepperdine University in California. He's also part of this small minority band of gender critical philosophers. Holly, Thomas, and I were at a conference in New Orleans. This was like a couple of years ago, and this was at uh, the Politics, Philosophy, and Economics Society meeting. And somehow Holly had managed to wangle a session on sex, and I think at least at that time the PPE Society was quite open to hearing voices on all sorts of topics. Anyway, so Holly gave a paper on, what was it? Something to do with sex slash gender identity, and Thomas gave a paper on sex, and I gave a paper. In fact, my paper was like the least. No, none of the papers was particularly inflammatory, but certainly mine was like the least inflammatory of the three. But one of my apparently enemies, some feminist philosophers, was sitting in the front row, and I had some slide up about. It was something about differences, psychological differences, basically between men and women. And I think this philosopher took a picture of it, my slide, with her phone, and live tweeted it, with something like the claim that I had said that men were smarter than women, or something like that. I had said absolutely no such thing. I had said absolutely no such thing. And then someone else, who was like, this was like a packed, the room was packed. It was quite a popular session, and of course, this kind of thing should never happen in some like academic session where someone takes a picture of your slide and then tweets it out in real time with some kind of complaint.
Mm-hmm.
And then someone else who was like checking his Twitter feed at the time, then like tweeted back at her, why don't you ask him? I mean, we're all in the room together. Why don't you ask him right now? What he meant or something. And then, all right, yeah. And then at the end of the session, I just like turned my phone over, then I happened to see all the what was going down on Twitter. Anyway, so that you can easily find that by googling that. Caused quite a fuss on the philosophy blogs, and but it was just like insane.
Did the tweeter
And
end up asking you in
oh
person?
yeah, right. No, she did actually ask me a question during the question period. I think she'd been sort of like shamed into doing it because this
Good.
other guy had like tweeted back at her.
Hmm.
And I tried to clear things up, but I mean, she didn't take the tweet down. Maybe it's still up, but at any rate, it certainly remained up for ages. And I mean, another event, not involving me, but recently my friend Moti Gorin, who teaches at Colorado State, he's a bioethicist. He's written some things about gender affirming care, and he was invited to be part of this panel on gender affirming care, the American Philosophical Association, which is the main professional association of philosophers, at one of their annual meetings. And this was quite recent. So on the one hand, it's a very welcome sign that the APA was prepared to put on a panel about gender affirming care, because it's like some obvious thing bioethicists should be talking about. Absolutely obvious thing. It's just like abortion. Abortion is one of these like medical/health issues that immediately raises philosophical questions, like, when does life begin, or was I ever a fetus, and that kind of thing. And then similarly with gender affirming care, bioethicists are not particularly interested in knee surgery because it doesn't raise any interesting philosophical questions. But gender affirming care, it's all like bound up with claims about transgender children and gender identity and stuff like that, and sex, and whether it's assigned at birth, and whatnot. Anyway, so obviously this is something that philosophers should be talking about. But when people discovered that Moti was on the panel, when the other people who were asked to be on this panel discovered that Moti was also on the panel, they declined, and in the event, the panel never went ahead because they just couldn't find people to be on the panel. So again, this is like so anti-intellectual.
Right.
It's hard.
And
I mean, the sort of thing would never, in any other area of philosophy, it would like never happen. So you would never get someone who was some philosopher who was like pro-choice to refuse to be on a panel with someone who was pro-life, who thought like, abortion is morally akin to murder or something. I mean, that kind of thing would never happen. The abortion people are very happy to talk to each other, even though they might disagree radically.
yeah,
But of course, when it comes to sex and gender, there's just like a big exception. It's not business as usual.
right, it's something totally otherworldly where they make it that it can't even be discussed. And it always gets me that people will remove their own voices from the conversation, like when people decline to be on a panel, because that happens all the time. I've heard of that happening. I've seen it happen in things that I was, part of organizing as well. And it's like, why do you want to remove your own voice? You have an opportunity to answer back to the things that you disagree with, and you're declining it. And in that case, they had the whole panel not go on, which is like probably the worst case outcome. It'd be better if they just removed their own voices, but if it could continue. But now they've stopped the entire conversation, which is really unfortunate.
And also, I mean, of course, one obvious point to make is, if you're so confident in the veracity of your own view, and you think it stands on very solid foundations, then what on earth do you have to fear from opponents?
Right.
It's like, there's a strong suspicion that people think, okay, my position is not going to look so attractive if it's aired in public alongside a critic. I mean, there was another earlier sort of classic case of this kind of thing, which just played out in public, and no one seemed to be remotely ashamed. So this was some years ago. Some relatively obscure website in the UK hosted this discussion about sex and gender with Kathleen, Holly Lawford-Smith, Julie Bindel on the sort of gender critical side, and two philosophers and the trans historian Susan Stryker on the trans rights activist side, or the trans rights side. And the six people, the format was just write a couple of paragraphs about sex and gender or something. And Kathleen and Holly and Julie wrote some quite, you can read them. They're still up on the website, I guess. Wrote some quite mild-mannered things. Nothing, they weren't saying, oh, we should be mispronouncing everyone, or no one should transition, or trans women are men, or anything like that. It was pretty mild. But then when the two philosophers and Stryker discovered that they were going to be on the web, or on the website, featured alongside Kathleen and Holly and Julie, they complained and came up with the immortal phrase non-consensual co-platforming. And they said, well, this is like terrible. We were, we're not. And then their contributions were withdrawn, and the most absurd thing.
I just can't believe that.
But they were not remotely ashamed of it. They were quite pleased with themselves, actually.
Yeah. The way they just took the language of, physical bodily harm, the non-consensual language, and used it for this, it's insulting, but it's so funny too. I mean, it's so childish and ridiculous. And the fear of being associated or being seen with someone else, that is definitely really, I experienced that in my cancellation too. As soon as I was fired, my boss put up a statement saying, we're so sorry about Sasha White's views. So here I am, like this formerly very private person. Now, at that point, there was no, going back. My name was out there associated with this, but he said, we're going to donate to trans affirming care and rent for trans people of color. And so it's just like they're absolutely terrified of being, that's not really comparable, right, because I wasn't, putting forth like well-developed ideas, but just tweets that they were upset about. Not like paragraphs like from what you're describing, this particular case with the professors. But yeah, I mean, what is that? Like, what is that non-consensually co-platformed? Like, what in the world are they thinking? And do people support that? Did that get a positive reception from their supporters?
I suspect, I don't know of any hard data on this, but I strongly suspect that the vast majority of philosophers thought this was ridiculous and just childish play acting. And yeah, and of course, right. Another thing I described this in the book. I just remembered in their complaint to the website, the two philosophers and Stryker had some remark about like the corrective rape of lesbians or something. Just to kind of illustrate how sort of terrible Holly, Kathleen, Julie's views were, or it was as if they were advocating for the corrective rape of lesbians. But of course, those three all are lesbians. So it's like,
yeah, it doesn't land quite as
well. So you've got like three lefty, well, certainly in the case of Holly and Julie, sort of lefty lesbians. You would have naively thought this would have bought them some brownie points. Sorry, that's a Britishism. That's probably doesn't.
Oh no, we say that. We say
brownie. Oh, you do say brownie points?
Yeah, we do.
What does that even mean anyway? I thought it came from.
From Girl Scouts?
Uh,
Or
from what?
from Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts?
Oh no, that's
Brownie
right.
points? Is
No,
that what it is?
but the uh the in Britain, I think there's some junior branch of the Girl Scouts which are called the Brownies
Okay. Mm-hmm.
because they wear like brown uniforms.
Mm-hmm.
Not because of their skin color or
Right.
anything
Well,
like.
no,
Although
you're gonna get
it's
canceled
just like
now.
a matter of time. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so I always thought that's where brownie points came from. Points that brownies get for doing, I don't know, selling cookies or something. But oh, incidentally, I don't know if you saw something about this recently. The Boy Scouts of America is they're still called the Boy Scouts of America, but now the word boy has been apparently expunged from all their sort of promotional material and
Ah,
so
I didn't
on.
know that.
So
Interesting.
um but um yeah, sorry, yeah, we're right. We were talking about these crazy
The
claim, or these
corrective.
absurd claims
Mm-hmm.
of harm. And as you say, it's like so insulting and insensitive to
Mm-hmm.
people who actually have been harmed.
Yeah.
You know, it's like the
Yeah.
whole idea of one academic saying to another, your words are harming me. It's like absolutely ridiculous,
Yeah.
given that, of course, academics lead the one, some of the safest, cushiest lives
Mm-hmm.
imaginable.
Right.
It's
Right.
like,
And it's supposed to be part of their job, right? I
well,
mean,
of course, yeah, of course.
yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, if you really think that words can harm, then you shouldn't be going into academia. Well, you certainly shouldn't be going into a profession like philosophy, which is all about um, criticizing other people, examining assumptions that we take for granted, potentially upending our worldview,
Mm-hmm.
making us uncomfortable. I mean, that's the whole. Like almost every philosophy one. I don't know if you've taken any philosophy classes, but like, I'm sure that in most philosophy 101 classes, the instructor starts by, really trying to like pump up the subject and make you excited and so on. And the way to do that is to say, well, you're gonna find lots of stuff in this class like potentially upsetting or threatening, or your worldview is going to be turned upside down. You won't know what to think at the end of the class. Am I living in the matrix or not? And you know does God exist or not, or is morality a load of old nonsense
Mm-hmm.
or not?
Yeah.
Then the students get, oh yeah, they all get terribly excited. Oh yeah, so this is awesome. Yeah, this is a kind of edgy subject. It's not just going to be some um, uh, boring catalogue of facts about dead white males or something,
Right. And
but
also
something
from
that's really going to.
yeah, no, sorry.
No, no, go.
I was just gonna say also from the other end, from the students, for the professors should be ready and prepared to hear things that are wrong or, wild or whatever controversial from their students as well, because that's a part of teaching and learning. And so for the professors themselves to be scared to touch certain things or to want to, like you said, take out all of that excitement and intensity around it, then how are the students even going to learn and challenge their own views? I mean, I
That's right.
remember, being in a philosophy 101 class, and it's like things are being challenged from all sides, but that's good. That's what it's about.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing you do typically in philosophy 101 classes is, because uh, it's a very good way of kind of easing students into philosophy. They would have thought about this before. Is to discuss theism, the question of whether whether God exists, and of course, in the class, are going to be devoutly religious students. Lo and behold, you're reading these papers which are, arguing that belief in God is completely irrational. It's like believing in in the tooth fairy. So that's a huge threat to their worldview. And philosophers typically think, oh well, yeah, this is a really good feature of the subject.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and then maybe just another point to make. This is going back to today's topic. It's not as if the gender critical crowd have particularly radical or exciting or counterintuitive views. So, one might have thought that the view that all women are female is like pretty boring. I mean, who would even bother arguing for that? But that's some that's some supposedly controversial gender critical view.
Mm-hmm.
And when I wrote my Are Women Adult Human Females paper, that was as far as I can make out, that was the very first paper in the entire 3,000 year history of philosophy where the view that women are adult human females was defended.
Mm-hmm.
It's not because I'm just some original genius who realized that this was an exciting view. Rather, it's just a reflection of the fact that hitherto people wouldn't have bothered. You wouldn't have thought this was like an interesting question.
Right. Yeah. And the well, I hope you're okay. Are you okay with staying a little longer?
Oh, totally.
So
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. Sorry. All we've talked about is cancellation. So I guess we should get on to something that's slightly more substantive.
No, it's so interesting to hear everything you're saying about the meta topics around your book and around the topic that you're on. But I do want to ask you a little bit about the book as well. And,
yeah. Absolutely.
But first, I also just wanted to say, in response to what you just said, it seems like the really exciting avant-garde idea that was put forth within philosophy, gender studies, and all that was this crazy, twisted idea of a male can be a woman and a female can be a man because social roles are disconnected from biology and all of that.
Right,
So,
exactly, yeah.
And then, but then,
that's right.
How did it go from, this is a big question, you don't have to answer this entire question, but it went from, okay, this is the new avant-garde idea and the old idea is boring, to the old idea is not just boring and out of date, it's heretical and dangerous.
No, yeah, that is an excellent question. So first of all, I think that, I mean, as far as I can make out, the women are adult human females view was never really in. I mean, you can find some authors who like tacitly accept it, but it was never kind of stated clearly as some obviously true view. And for a lot of ever since the publication of Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex in 1949, the received view in sort of academic feminism seems to have been that to be a woman is not just a matter of biology. And I think that was really the received view, not because Beauvoir had any good arguments against the biological view, but rather they seem to have thought in some inarticulate way that, okay, biology is generally bad. Biology constrains women. Certainly the view that, biology dictates that women should stay home and look after the children and that men should go out and work in the fields and provide for the family and so on and be the leaders. That view is totally pernicious. And that seems to have led not just to the view, not just to a kind of gender blank slatism, namely that there aren't really any interesting psychological differences based in biology between human males and human females, but it also seems to have led to the view that to be a woman can't just be, sorry, to be a woman can't just be a matter of your biology. There's got to be much more to being a woman than just being a mature female of our species. Otherwise, and here the sort of leap of logic gets extremely wide and basically unbridgeable. Otherwise, biological determinism will follow, and we'll have to agree that biology dictates that women have to stay home and can't have careers and so on. But none of this was really explicitly spelled out. And anyway, as I try to argue in the book, somewhat ironically, it's very implausible that Beauvoir herself held this view. I think she thought that women were adult human females, basically. But anyway, so all right, so now you have the positive view that to be a woman is to occupy some kind of social role in society. Okay, but then, as you say, there's this rival view, which may well be false, but it still doesn't look like terribly sort of offensive or harmful or damaging. Namely, that women are adult human females. On the one hand, you've got the view that to be a woman is a bit like, being a police officer or being a doctor or being a plumber or being an actor. You have to be part of a society and play a certain role within that society in order to be a plumber or a doctor or an actor. And then similarly with being a woman. And then on the other hand, you've got the biological view. And okay, let's agree that the biological view is false, but still, it doesn't seem to be terribly offensive or beyond the pale. Okay, but then, now slowly working up to a reply to your question, we have the rise of the trans rights movement and the transgender tipping point in 2014 and so on. And we have the activist slogan that trans women are women. And that slogan has something of the status of Black Lives Matter as a slogan, in that, obviously it's true in the case of Black Lives Matter, whatever you might think of that slogan, you can't deny it. You can't say, well, yeah, actually my view is that Black Lives don't matter or something. That would be crazy. And so there was a similar vibe around trans women and women, that to deny that trans women are women, it's a bit like saying that Black lives don't matter. You're just like, obviously some morally depraved person if you say the latter thing. Okay, but then if women are adult human females, and assuming that humans can't change sex, it follows straight away that trans women, being male, are not women. So I think that's why the biological view became not just regarded as false, but regarded as unsayable. Or at any rate, if you did say it, you immediately revealed yourself to be a terrible person, in the same way that you would reveal yourself to be a bad person if you said, no, Black lives don't matter. The entire Black Lives Matter movement is like founded on this false premise that Black lives matter.
Right. Right. You're denying their humanity.
I think that's why. Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But, and then, I mean, as I think I might have actually said something about to this effect in the paper, but it was like obvious that like compromising, that is saying that okay, I agree that trans women are women because either to be a woman is to occupy some kind of social role, and trans women do occupy that social role, or to be a woman is to have a certain kind of female gender identity, and trans women have that kind of female gender identity. But I'm going to hold the line at male and female. So trans women are definitely women, but they aren't female. Okay, it was obvious, I think, to any outsider that compromise, which some, I think, gender critical feminists tried to encourage at one point, absolutely was not going to work, and it is just as heretical to say that trans women are male as it is to say that they're not women. And I think this is where all this earlier stuff about sex being multidimensional and massively confusing, and we should really just say that it's assigned at birth because who knows what sex itself is, then came into play, because it allowed the trans rights side to say not so much that trans women are female, but rather that, look, the whole notion of sex is just like totally obscure, and who knows, it's just, we should really stop talking about males and females in the human case.
Mm-hmm.
So you absolutely can't, as you know, you cannot hold the line and say, okay, yeah, I totally agree, trans women are women. However, you have to admit that they're male, right? But obviously that's not going to work.
Right. And as you write about in the book as well, a lot of the gender critical feminists have had to kind of re-examine, or at least go back into the whole idea that was brought up by Simone de Beauvoir, where you mention these feminists who kind of cut their teeth on that phrase, a woman is made, not born, now are
Yeah.
struggling to defend why women should have their own sports or things like that. And biology is coming back into, the forefront for them. And also, and I thought this was a very, very interesting part of the book, because it was a little bit also provocative even among gender critical feminists, which I think is great, that you're talking about the very real differences between men and women that not only mean that we should have, our own sports or changing rooms or prisons or things like that, but that also might have an impact on how society is set up at large. And you discuss the question, is patriarchy universal? And also
Yeah.
the question, is it inevitable? And I was very intrigued by that chapter. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about, some of those questions that you looked
Oh,
into.
yeah, sure. Right. So, yeah, as you said, this is really a matter of sort of second wave feminist dogma coming back to bite feminists many years later. So, and here I think the biologist and gender studies academic Anne Fausto Sterling has, no doubt inadvertently, sown a huge amount of confusion on this on this topic. So yeah, it became fairly orthodox to deny any biologically based psychological differences between men and women, but also to at least downplay the physical differences between men and women. At one point, Fausto Sterling suggested that the difference between the height difference between men and women, obviously men are taller than women on average, could be partly closed by better nutrition. In fact, she got that completely the wrong way round. It's because males suffer much more height-wise if nutrition is bad. So the way to increase the height difference between men and women is to ensure that both sexes are adequately fed. And she also suggested at one point that there's various sporting gaps between men and women would close. Um, in a way, it wasn't like so unreasonable because, like in the 70s and 80s, the gap certainly had been closing, but certainly in retrospect, that was just because, that was the era of greater female participation in sports. So they had lots of easy ground to make up, and basically the gap hasn't closed since the 1980s. Um, and yeah, and then on patriarchy, so there was a fascinating book published, which I talk about in that the whole chapter is like framed around this book in I think 1974. Anyway, the heyday of second wave feminism by Stephen Goldberg, who was then the chair of sociology at CUNY in New York, called The Inevitability of Patriarchy. And he argued in that book that by patriarchy we mean roughly the overwhelming dominance of men in positions of political and social authority. And he argued that that had a biological basis, and he fingered in particular the hormone testosterone as the main driver of this sex difference. And then so his argument was like a straightforward biological determinist argument. He said, well, okay, this has biological causes, and because we're not going to give anti-androgens to every man in the future, the hormonal differences will remain, and so these social differences will remain. I mean, I think so. The upshot of that chapter is, well, he was wrong about patriarchy in his sense being inevitable, but and he also got various things about the biology wrong, but I don't think he was sort of fundamentally wrong. And I think there are biologically rooted psychological differences between men and women that pretty much guarantee that in free and open democratic societies of the kind we find in the West, where roughly people are free to pursue the careers that interest them the most, you will find, and quotas are not imposed, you will find a predominance of men in leadership positions, and the sexes will shake out very differently when it comes to occupations, and there will always be a massive sex difference when it comes to violence, particularly lethal violence. Yeah, but of course that to certainly to the sort of second wave feminist sensibility, all that sounds like really bad and regressive, and sounds like it shouldn't be true, so therefore it isn't true. But I think it probably is true. I mean, what's interesting, I'm not quite sure I have a totally satisfactory explanation for that, for this, but many feminists are very keen to emphasize the physical athletic differences between men and women. So they're like totally on board with this. But when it comes to psychological differences, they're much more wary, and they're much more inclined to seek some social explanation for the sex difference in interest in computer coding, or the sex difference in working with children, for instance.
Hmm. And I mean, do you think that there is a way for there to be, I mean, I believe this is what you're trying to do with your book, but a way for there to be a neutral conversation around that where it can be talked about that these facts or these questions are not meant to hurt women, but in fact, they could be used if we're going to talk about, special protections for women or places where we need categories where we should recognize differences.
Yeah, of course. Yes, of course. I mean, you have to. I mean, I don't think that the like, the fact that um, preschool teaching is overwhelmingly a female occupation, or that uh, psychology is now a much more female than male profession, or that philosophy is predominantly male. I don't think these sorts of disparities are any cause for concern. I mean, there's nothing here that needs fixing, um, that needs fixing necessarily. But certainly, sometimes things do need fixing. Um, it, it's not so much that you want, say, when it comes to lethal violence, it's not so much that the important thing is to get parity between the sexes. So maybe we should encourage women to murder more, and then it'll be great if the murder rate is the same between males and females. But rather, you want, of course, what you want to do is to decrease violence generally, and since males are responsible for the vast bulk of it, you want to understand just why it is that males are more violently inclined than females. I mean, in order to solve a problem, you have to understand the the causes of that problem. So you're just making things much, much harder for yourself and potentially putting more lives at risk if you have the wrong explanation, because then your solution is not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly to say that um, the male enthusiasm for violence has strong biological roots is by no means to say that um, high levels of male violence are inevitable. Um, Something can be both biological and uh, subject to cultural forces. You can damp down male violence by all sorts of cultural interventions.
Mm-hmm.
You can just kind of analogously, um, having poor eyesight is a biological, in some instances, a genetic matter, but you can cure it by wearing glasses. So to say that something is biological is not to say that it's inevitable or not fixable or curable.
Mm-hmm. And there's been so much emotion put into the discussion from all sides, so people will not even want to hear some of these ideas being explored. But as we start to wrap up today, I just want to encourage people to please go out and buy the book. I will link it
Oh,
below.
awesome! Oh,
And
thanks so much.
yeah, and there are
Yeah, buy my book. Buy my book.
buy the book. Go buy it right now,
Yeah.
wherever you are. It's available here in the US and, of course, in the UK. And there are so many more interesting things that we didn't get a chance to discuss in the book, but other things that kind of started to come up, like really interesting facts about how evolution shaped the differences between men and women, the idea of fear, that there was an evolutionary purpose for women to have more fear than men and for men
Yeah.
to have more aggression, dominance, and so those things are really worth discussing and really interesting and always, of course, relevant to the discussions of today. So, just to wrap it up, Professor Byrne, what are you working on now, or what's next for you?
Um, well, I am actually. I mean, the book doesn't talk about gender affirming care. I thought that potato was far too hot for me to handle. But I suppose I've like grown a slightly thicker skin over the last few years. So I just wrote something with Moti Gorin, who I mentioned, on philosophy and gender affirming care, which is coming out in this volume edited by the physicist Lawrence Krauss, and it's just about how philosophers and bioethicists have completely dropped the ball when it comes to this very important topic. And I recently reviewed, so you must have heard of Jack Turban, who's a very prominent proponent of gender affirming care. He's a child and adolescent psychiatrist at UC San Francisco. He recently wrote a book called Free to Be: Understanding Kids and Gender Identity. And I recently reviewed that for a website called Fairer Disputations. You can find the link on my website, alexbyrne.org. Yeah, so there's so I've been easing into even more controversial gender-related topics, but philosophy of mind is one of my great interests, and I'm going to write a sort of introductory book on that subject in the fall, I hope. But yeah, I'm afraid you haven't seen the last of me as far as sex and gender goes. I mean, it's just like the most fascinating subject. What could be more interesting than the differences between the sexes? And obviously so much of life is like necessarily structured around the fact that we come in male and female varieties, and also just like the phenomenon of transsexualism, gender dysphoria. It's just genuinely interesting, I think. And I mean, one of the great benefits of getting into this subject is that I don't really get out all that much, being an academic, but I have met all sorts of fascinating people, trans and otherwise, who I just wouldn't have met. I wouldn't have met otherwise, and that's been, yeah. I mean, that's just been really, really fascinating. I mean, everyone has a personal story. It's of some interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Humans are more interesting than I had thought that they would be.
So this topic led you to see some other sides of humanity.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
It's made me a better person. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think I can say the same for myself. I've learned so much about individuals, and I've changed many of my views within the gender world. And I'm glad to hear that you're talking a bit about gender affirming care as well now. That's one of the most disturbing parts of this. And I think also one of the most, even though, like you said, you need a thick skin to delve into that, but I think the best way to have that thick skin is to know that there's something really important behind what you're saying, and behind that is maybe the most important thing, is the health and the future and the bodies
yeah,
of these
sure.
people.
No, here we really are talking about very important life decisions for people. We're not just talking about men with a couple of children who decide to transition in their 40s or something, and what to do with them, or what rights and privileges should they be allowed. But instead, we're talking about potentially radical sterilizing medical treatments on minors. And what's fascinating is, I mean, I'm English originally, is the transatlantic difference on this issue. So, We just had the final report of Hilary Cass's review on pediatric gender medicine come out in the UK. That was in April. And unsurprisingly, if you've been following this topic at all, she reported that the evidence in this area is remarkably weak. This is absolutely no surprise to anyone who knows anything about this subject. But of course, the Cass review has not gone down particularly well here. I mean, in the US, and this country is still set on the gender affirming path, unlike much of Europe and certainly the UK. So it'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot more work to be done. So thank you so much, Professor Byrne. I really enjoyed getting to speak with you. Thanks for taking all the time
Sasha,
to
yeah,
do so.
same here. It's a total pleasure. You should call me Alex. I hate being called professor.
Oh, you
It's
do?
like,
Okay.
whatever.
All right.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, or
thank
even
you.
doctor. Doctor is like doctor is ridiculous. I'm just like a fake doctor. I'm not a real doctor. Anyway, yeah, no, it was a great honor to be on your podcast.
Thank
Thanks
you
so
so much. And if you're ever available in some time in the future, I'd love to have you back. Maybe we could have another discussion. There's so much more I'd love to
absolutely,
ask you.
yeah. No, delighted.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you.